Yeah, here we go. So from the comfort of his office chair, I love that bit. I do love Zoom in that respect. So yeah, wine's been around about as long as some of the members I've seen drinking it earlier on the screens here, um, and it's been ever present during sort of European history, really. Greeks through the Romans to the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. If you want to start looking for pictures of Europeans boozing, they are not hard to find. Um, there's home. That was a Polaroid taken at home. There's Dad under the table. Yeah, happy days. And there's there's a painting of the Glassware Company inaugural Beano, and it's interesting to see that the Beadle hasn't changed, and Stephen Pollock Hill, Martin Scarth, and Barbara are all visible in that shot. Insane, but true. So the reason that we're so into boozing in Europe is because of this. What do these complaints have in common? Is there a doctor in the house? What's the common thread between all these? Of course, you're on mute. Well, the answer is, of course, don't drink the water. They are all waterborne diseases, and so it's one of life's great imperatives. Obtaining oxygen, water, and food in that order. If you put a plastic bag over somebody's head and tighten it up, they'll probably be gone in 5 minutes. You deprive people of food. Well, as Bobby Sands, we've still got somebody needs muting. And if you're Bobby Sands, a fit 40-year-old man, then you might live for 40 days in an H block before you actually die. I really wish somebody would mute themselves. So this problem became more acute, So it's oxygen is 5 minutes, food is 40 days, but if you don't drink water, if you don't drink clean liquid, you're dead within 36 hours. So clearly oxygen is the priority, but really right after that, we need to drink clean stuff. Otherwise, you end up in the cemetery, or at worst, or on the loo at best. So, as society urbanized, particularly in Europe, then the imperative to find supplies of clean water became even more desperate. It's okay if you hiding, living on top of the Alps, and were able to go and scoop a bucket of ice up and melt it. That's absolutely no problem at all. But if you're living in a city, then how on earth do you get fresh liquid? Well, the world, in a completely strange foible of human anthropology, arrived at the answer to that question in two entirely different ways. And so if we were to examine the world sort of outside what we could loosely call Europe, what they did there, whether it be in Peru or Mexico or Australia or China or wherever else you want to talk about, then what they did is that they found plants, herbs, leaves, and fruits and various things, and boiled water and poured boiling water onto those natural products to create infusions. So whether they be chocolate or coffee or mint or whatever, that's how they did it. And of course, the act of boiling the water killed the microbes that would otherwise sort of leave you in dire straits. And of course, as a result of this, they became ceramic-based societies, because until the advent of Mr. Pyrex in 1916, you couldn't pour boiling water into glass without shattering it. However, in Europe, we approached this issue in an entirely different way. We too collected seeds and grains and plants and the rest of it, but we didn't boil them or add boiling water to them. What we did is we brewed, distilled, and fermented them into alcoholic beverages. And if one is to look at the periodic table of poisons, then one quite quickly finds that alcohol is right near the top of that list. It's obviously not as potent as cyanide and arsenic, but it's right up there. You know, what's your poison? Alcohol. So, and obviously over the centuries, we have become immune, in large part immune to that, to the alcohol. So if you were in the Orient or elsewhere other than Europe, you had a cup of tea, and if you were in Europe, you went down the pub. And that is how we continue to live safely. And it was absolutely universal, you know. As soon as you were off the nipple, literally off the nipple, then you were on the booze. Come on, little baby Jesus, drink your wine, your perry, your mead, your beer, whatever it was. The alcohol that was to hand was used as soon as the breast milk was finished with. And of course, this being this sort of alcohol, being this talisman of life, staff of life, it was accorded by the societies who used it, well, many of the societies that used it, with a kind of a sanctified status. So in Rome and Greece, they had Dionysus and Bacchus as the representations of the god of booze, basically. And you don't have to travel far. Look hard on Google Images to find treatments by the greatest artists that have ever lived of Bacchus / Dionysus. This, interestingly, is Prince Regent, who got Rubens to do this portrait of him. He actually paid to look like this. I must admit, I might be slightly grumpy if a portrait of me came back looking like this, but he apparently loved it. And of course, that kind of switch, that concept is switched, because we have the god of wine, but we also have wine as a representation of God. Take this blood of Christ, and that is absolutely fundamental to belief to millions of people on this planet. The booze is actually, in that moment, the blood of their Lord. Because, you know, alcohol's got two sides to it. You know, there's the kind of rave up, have a good time, but there's also the darker side. So if we look at this monumental painting by George Cruikshank, it took him 3 years to paint it. It's about the size of a London bus. And you can break this down. You can obviously see there's an awful lot going on in it. And what happens is, of course, the way the alcoholic shock waves go back through the painting. So at the beginning, we've got the circle of life, you know, represented for the purposes of this talk. It's just taking one. There's the baptism. So we have a table bedecked with glasses and wine to welcome the little baby into the Christian brotherhood. But then as we go further into the painting, we start seeing kind of sort of mayhem and degradation. And further back still, of course, we end up with violence and people smashing the heads of people over the head with shillelaghs and the corpses being carried away. Again, Cruikshank, a great moralist, you know, the gin juggernaut, or the worship of the great spirit of the age. You know, it's a gin still. And as it rolls forward, it crushes the helpless population under its barrel-like wheels. And the effects of alcohol have been known for a very long time. Ubulus, writing in quite a long time ago, observed that the first glass was to health. You know, cheers! The second was to love and pleasure. The third to sleep. The fourth belongs to violence. The fifth to uproar. The sixth to drunken revel. The seventh to black eyes. The eighth to the policeman. Ninth to biliousness. And 10th to madness and hurling the furniture. And I'm really looking forward to staying with the Pollock Hills in a couple of weeks, because that's the kind of evening I'm looking forward to. So wine, you know, it's a naturally occurring what is it? It's a drink, naturally occurring alcoholic drink. Certain monkeys and birds are known to wait for fruit to rot to a specific point where the sugars within it turn to alcohol, and they'd rather not. They'd rather leave it when it's all sugary and sweet until it turns into booze, at which point they tuck into it and get pigleted, and that's a fact. And so, but there's a defining moment at which point, you know, vines develop to a point where we can pinpoint the birth of kind of quote modern wine, and that happened probably in Georgia. I mean Georgia, Tbilisi kind of Georgia rather than Georgia on my mind, and a bag of seeds, grape seeds from Georgia were discovered in an earthenware crock buried from about 6,000 years ago. And hitherto, all grape seeds had been like any other bag of seeds, tomatoes or whatever, and the agriculturalists planted they were sexual, the seeds, and they had to plant 100 in order to determine which were the males and which were the females. And in as part of their process, they would wait for them all to grow into small plants. They would then determine which one were the males and kill them all, and planted just the females, because the females were the great bearing variety type. Whereas this particular crop of seeds found in Georgia, dating from all those centuries ago, were hermaphrodite. They had been genetically modified by the ancients 6,000 years ago to produce hermaphrodite seeds, all of which would produce fruit. Extraordinary but true. It's not just Monsanto who got into a genetic modification. And similarly, off Georgia, a cargo was found that sort of dated around the time of these first professional seeds, if you like. And I don't know if you can see that, but there are 2 wine cups buried in the silt. Here, you'll get a better look at them in a minute. But one is kind of mouth down in the silt, and the other one's on its side. You'll see, and hieroglyphics, paintings from Egypt from roughly the same period, illustrate the really professional nature of viniculture at that time. Vessels were to cater to demand for wine developed almost simultaneously. This sort of jar, these sort of jars are found, are incredibly numerous and commonly found. And it was kind of, you know, nothing's changed really. Hey, babe, take a walk on the wild side, isn't it? I mean, that's really, whoever, hey, Cleopatra, fancy a booze up, you know. Same reasons as today. And here's a typical wine vessel of the first decanter, as it were, which is sort of obviously a kind of flower pot with go faster stripes. It's very low technology, low fire crockery, and again they survive in enormous numbers. And there's the wine cup of antiquity, and they didn't have, you know, we're way beyond before glasses at this point, but this was the standard vessel of Greek culture. And of course, what you did was took each handle in a hand each and lift the saucer to your lips. And these were subject to some extremely fruity and interesting decoration, but always on the inside, never on the outside. They were intended to as one drank, the figurative decoration on the inside of the bowl became apparent. So this sort of stuff's fairly typical. But there's some much racier ones. Now, I know some of Paul has warned me that some of you are a rather nervous disposition and should possibly, those who are likely to faint the idea of shocking images should probably shield their eyes for a couple of secs whilst I just run through a couple of the typical insides of Greek drinking vessels. So close your eyes now, please. There's one. So there's Bacchus looking very pleased with himself. This is absolutely standard stuff. I haven't looked for the most salacious, but this is my favorite. This one is obviously they're planning to enter this as a new Olympic sport in Tokyo, in fact. But yeah, that's a decoration from a 3,000-year-old Greek wine vessel. Yeah, no, you can rejoin us now, those. So again, we repeatedly see Dionysus and Bacchus in various guises, often in a vineyard and so on. And it's interesting from a kind of historian sort of viewpoint to actually see the actual. So you see this picture here, and then you find that image there. You know, and you think, wow, these aren't kind of approximate drawings. They really are drawings of the real object. Amazing to be able to twin those. Such a luxury in terms of showing the vivid nature of these objects. And look at that one. I mean, that's solid gold. But if you look down at the foot, it's formed on a goat's hoof. So you've got this completely insane juxtaposition between the most base and the most flamboyant vessel itself. I mean, who was using this sort of stuff? I mean, yeah. And who says they didn't have a sense of humor? Talk about taking the bull by the horns, drinking cup. Brilliant. Look at it. I want one. Just fantastic stuff. I mean, just links you into the people. That's how I see it. Now that's silver and gold. Something like Bulgaria, that's from. Beaten silver, mounted in gold. You think, well, you know, that must be an abstract to, if you think what, you know, the general kind of mud-kicking grub that lived in the country at the time, his or her connection to a vessel like that must have been absolutely tenuous at the most extreme. But then you see this, where you see that's a coin, that's a contemporary coin from that country with Neptune actually holding one of these vessels. These are not so divorced from the people. Same as it's ever been. Let's have a rave up. Bring in the band. Bring on the booze and let's have a rave up. Wine obviously was transported over huge distances. It became one of the major trading commodities across empires, with vast quantities crossing each other on the seas. And then, you know, if you stopped in at the kind of Weatherspoons of the age near Pompeii, of course, you could go in and you could order wine. You know, what do you fancy? Do you fancy Chianti, or you want a Rheinischer, Rheinischer White, or what do you, bit of local Plonk? We got it all. You know, the good stuff's a bit more expensive. What do you fancy? It's availability of diversity taken to all corners of the Roman Empire. And if you look at all the pink and the green bits, I mean, that was effectively the wine-growing region of Europe at the time. And, of course, it was also the Roman Empire. And, ideas and stuff crossed that empire in a way that we find quite difficult to understand. The alacrity and ease of transporting merchandise and ideas was, I think, beyond modern comprehension, in fact. And so when a good idea came up, what do we know about the Romans? Well, they knew a good idea when they saw it. So when we have the birth of glass blowing, right down there, Judea, look at Judea and kind of put 100-mile, kind of 200-mile kind of radius around there, then that's pretty much where glass blowing was first discovered, just before the birth of Christ, Well, that idea spread like wildfire. And within 100 years, we found that there's been a glass furnace and cutting wheels found in Warrington within the sort of first century of the Roman Empire in Britain. And this is the sort of vessel that they were making at the time. And this is the famous Ennion, who actually signed his work. These are all before the end of the first century AD. And what happened, of course, they took the formats. They hadn't quite worked out in all senses the ergonomics of use, but so they took old design prototypes and then reproduced them in glass. So here's Ennion again with again the twin-handled wine cup has come down from Greece through in crockery and in precious metals and is now reproduced in glass. Ennion again. And if you think back to the one of Cleopatra, there she and Mark Antony or whoever he was, doesn't look very Roman to me. But if you look at the vessel in his hands, what we're seeing in right so that's 2000 BC, and yet the one on the left is actually the one on the right rather is AD, but it's the identical form, once in crockery, now in glass. And of course, glass was just the most extraordinary substance in that it was easy to make, it was cheap, it was mostly made of sand rather than gold or whatever. It was easily made, cheap, eminently practical. You could see how much you had left in it. You knew if it needed washing, and it was wonderful to drink out of. Within a century, somebody had made the Lycurgus cup in the British Museum. This is carved glass, right? This is well before Mr. Black, Mr. Decker, or electric tools or something. This is all carved out manually. It's about 4 inches tall. It's in the British Museum, and if you stand there for on the 30-second cycle, what happens is the light that shines upon it changes from fluorescent to whatever it is, can't remember now, which changes its color before your eyes. Yeah, incandescent to fluorescent. There you go. How they knew what incandescent and fluorescent light were going to do in 100 AD, I've got no idea. They obviously had absolutely no idea it would do that, its makers, but as it happens, it does. And you just got to stand there in the BM for free, or when you get in and don't have to buy a ticket and all that. I'm trying to get into London museums at the moment, like trying to break into Fort Knox unless you buy a ticket. So yeah, Roman Empire ultimately faded and died, and so did glassmaking. Glassmaking kind of retrenched to certain specific areas of the Roman Empire, northern Italy, of course, areas of Germany and Holland, and there was certainly an active Anglo-Saxon glass-making entity. Again, the preconceptions or what we're taught at school that the Anglo-Saxons were a bunch of woad-covered nitwits who wouldn't know their arse from their elbow is obviously preposterous. You just have to look at, the Shropshire hoard and the gold that was recovered from that, which I've seen in a couple of locations, is just absolutely out of this world. And similarly, they were fairly okay glassmakers too. Quite where they were situated, we don't know. They've been found in this country really from a kind of south end to Margate in a 50-mile kind of arc, really. So it's very much in the Thames estuary. And so there's quite a strong likelihood that they were it's almost inevitable that they were either made on the continent and imported into London, or were actually made in the southeast, but as we don't know. So there isn't an intact one left. There isn't. Nobody has ever found an intact piece of Anglo-Saxon glass. They're all damaged in some way or other. And here are a few of them. But there were no slouches. And all wine cups, of course, all for consuming booze. But basically, I mean, European glass of the medieval era wasn't up to much. Venetians were sort of okay, but most of it was iron stained, raw, woodland made in of sort of rubbish, really made in woodland. I mean, charming, I don't doubt that, but on a technical level, this is pretty rubbishy glass. If this is the best that Barbara could have made, you know, she would have given up. But, you know, at the same time in Europe, we're making the most extraordinary vessels in rock crystal. Although this is Fatimid, but that's made in Egypt about 1,000 years ago. But this is made in Milan around 1600, in rock crystal mounted in gold, because obviously a rock crystal version on its own isn't flash enough, and you've got to chuck a bit of gold on it to sparkle it up a bit. Again, I mean, you can imagine making this stuff. I mean, the craftsmanship involved in making that raw crystal, right? It's harder than high tensile steel, but as fragile as glass. And you've got to carve a single boulder out to create this hallucinogenic object. Mad, completely mad. Money and talent. And in the meantime, of course, the Middle Easterns continued, as they ever had been, to be the world masters of glassmaking, and turning out stuff like this and like that, until they hit a problem. And the problem was that Tamerlane's army invaded Damascus, Syria. And this vast Mongol army marched into Syria with the avowed intention of totally flattening the place, which they did. And this happened in 1405, at which point, you know, the entire population of Syria fled westwards, because that was the way away from Tamerlane and his ghastly crew. And of course, all these, you know, the world's greatest mathematicians and astronomers and doctors and architects and all the rest of it, and glass makers, all rushed out of Syria across the Middle East, across the Mediterranean, through Turkey and up. You know, when will we ever learn? You know, same as it's just happened 15 years ago. Identical story, except George Bush and Tony Blair weren't involved in that one. And so what they did is they brought their talents with them. That's what they made before they left. And that's what they made after they arrived. And the significant difference, the only significant difference between how do I go backwards? That object and the one that succeeded it is that this one had on it the legend, Allah is great, whereas its successor had written on it, I am beautiful. Because, of course, if you go into Venice in 1405 and start shouting that Allah is great, it's the first way you end up being, you know, turned into a firelighter. And these guys just were the greatest glassmakers in the world. And what happened is, of course, they arrived in Venice, augmenting skills that already existed there, and the place went completely bonkers. It was like Manchester City, who had been doing absolutely nothing for decades and decades until the Arabs took them over, pumped them full of money and buying talent, and of course become champions. And that's pretty much what happened in Venice. They supercharged the quality of Venetian glass and really founded what we could describe today as the foundation of modern glass industry, really. If the colour wasn't flash enough, then smear a load of gold on it. Whereas most of the people in this country at that time were drinking out of these. You know, this is, you know, only the kings and the archbishops and so on were drinking out of the finery. Most people drank out of one of these, and they're called blackjacks. And, you know, if one man went to mow a meadow or off to, you know, Canterbury Cathedral to pay homage and all that kind of stuff, then what you did is you filled this up with whatever hooch you wanted to take with you, because you couldn't rely on what you were likely to pick up along the route. because the importance of staying healthy through what you drank, and you drank out of leather. So here's my colleague, John Foster, off the roadshow. This is about getting on for 10 years now. We were in Norfolk, and he found this blackjack. Amazing thing. I mean, they're pretty rare. And that silver baroque cartouche on it is engraved with a legend. And the legend states that this blackjack used to be the left-hand buttock of Oliver Cromwell's warhorse. True. Apparently, we all had a taste out of it later, and we can certify that the contents actually tasted like bum. So along comes the first British glassmaker, a British glassmaker, well-known Millwall fan called Jacopo Verzolini. And Jacopo Verzolini was obviously Italian, and he came over to gain the monopoly of glassmaking under Elizabeth I. And as you can imagine, there's been so much work done on the survivors. There are about, I think, 11 pieces of surviving Verzolini. And this one in particular has been, put to the most exhaustive testing, and it's been discovered that it was probably made in 1586. All decorated by another immigrant, Anthony Delisle, who was a Huguenot. All emblazoned with royal and very highfalutin insignia and ciphers. Only the very wealthy. This was made for the Queen. Extraordinary they survived. So fragile. What happened now, sort of from this point onwards, is there's a major, major breakthrough in technical glassmaking. Glass is about to undergo one of the most radical changes it's ever gone through in the history, and in its 5,000-year history. So if you go aboard the Mary Rose, I've had the privilege of doing so. Guy knew I was coming, knew who I was, and he held his hand out as we went into the stores. Had the most amazing day there. And he held out his palm. I said, I know what you've come to see. I said, what's that? He said, the glass we found on here. I said, yeah. And he opened his palm, and there were 5 little kind of pieces of glass smaller than a sugar cube. And he said, that is all the glass we found on the Mary Rose. 4 of them were out of the barber surgeon's cabin, and another one was out of the captain's cabin. And they were tiny. One was just a fragment, and 3 were little kind of sort of grease jars of some kind. In other words, there was no glass of any consequence on the King's flagship when it sank in the Solent, fully kitted up. So I think we can deduce there was very little glass in that society. You go forward 120 years, there's HMS London, and she was wrecked off Southend in 120 years later, and she's very well preserved at the bottom there, and she's a veritable crystal palace. Between 1546 and 1665, there is just the most amazing transformation from no glass to absolutely oodles of it. The windows were glazed on are glazed on HMS London. And this coincided with a talk that you had recently, which is sort of Royal Society and all those guys. And so, firstly, Antonio Neri publishes the first technical glassmaker's guide in Venice in about 1620 or something. And so here you had a manual. It's like a sort of Mary Berry of glassmaking. And then Christopher Merritt translates Neri's book into English, published, I think, 1662. And here really was the kind of like the tablets of knowledge being passed down from Mount Sinai, really. Moses, Merritt, comes along and says, there you go, guys. There are your rules of life, or at least your rules of glassmaking. And it was revelatory, of course. If you could read and you could, in English, and you could follow a recipe, then you put an ounce of this in it and 14 pounds of that. If you could do that, then your glass got a lot better. And the Royal Society, of course, were absolutely behind this. You know, you've got this sort of, you know, Christopher Wren, Boyle, Harvey, and Newton, and all these complete brain boxes all coexisting in London at the same time. Well, the result was just mega on glassmaking. British glassmaking came alight. You know, new furnace technology, recipes, all tools, all the rest of it. And here we've got this most extraordinary image of a nativity. Effectively, it's at the end of a corridor in the National Gallery, and as you walk along, you can see it from afar. It's 50 meters away, and you think, well, there's Caravaggio with another baby Jesus. But of course, as you approach, of course, it isn't a nativity of the Christian deity. It's the nativity of an entirely different kind of deity. And that deity is science. This is the birth of modern science, painted 100 years after the effect. It's Boyle's experiment, and by Joseph Wright of Derby. And of course, if you analyze this painting, it is just absolutely rammed full of glass. You know, the guy's timing the experiment on his watch with a lens on it. The light is emanating from there. The dove is held within a glass chamber, and you know the scene is being sub-illuminated by glass coming through the window, by the moon coming in through the glazed window. And the most immediate effect was touched on before. You know, you go from the shaft and globe bottle. This Killam Digby from 1630s develops this bottle. I must say, I absolutely take exception with the claims that the bottles of those bottles he illustrated. I'm sorry to go on, but there is no proof, as far as I'm aware, that bottles like that for sure were being made in 1630, as illustrated in your last talk. 1660, we know that these were being made, definitely. The earliest date sealed example is 1657, and the earliest seal we know is 1650. So claims to 1630 remain, in my book, unproven. But we go 1660, 1670, 1680, cusping on 1700, 1740, and by 1765, we end up with that. And I wonder how many of you poured out of that tonight. You know, I don't mean the very one, but one that is, to all intents and purposes, identical, albeit entirely made by machine today, and that will go in the rubbish bin for recycling, hopefully, when you've finished with it. But we go through that cycle of basically 100 years, where we develop what is effectively a perfect object. You know, the drawing pin, the wheel, the side stacking bottle. And of course, its greatest advantage is you could lay your wine down. And that meant that you could leave it for longer than 10 minutes before it became vinegar. And of course, it absolutely revolutionized how we perceived and drank and stored wine. So this guy certainly recognized it. The birth of fine wine was, fortunately, you know, we have Arnaud de Pontac is who that is. And Arnaud de Pontac was a kind of bourgeois Bordeaux vineyard, son of a vineyard owner. His father. So this is Arnaud de Pontac III. Well, his father, needless to say, was Arnaud de Pontac II, and Arnaud de Pontac II gave the third 2 vineyards. One was in the Medoc and one blah blah blah, and so these were rundown vineyards that had sort of, you know, had potential. And Arnaud de Pontac, the son, comes up with this idea that actually, if you treat the vines in an entirely revolutionary way, you're likely to get a better result. So what he did is that he allowed the first growth of the vines to push their first growth of the first group of grapes, and then thereafter he pruned the vines. And so you didn't have, if you leave your vines running in your conservatory, you might have 17 growths on them. But none of that with Arnaud. What he did is he snipped off all the second growth and the third, and so all the goodness came out of the roots into a very small and select group of grapes. And his wine was Aubryon. And he, of course, London at that point, between the marriage of Eleanor d'Aquitaine to Henry II, of course, London had the Bordeaux privilege. And the Bordeaux privilege was that all the wines grown in Aquitaine, that's, Cahors, Toulouse, Bordeaux, and so on, all of that wine was imported 100% into London. And so we actually ended up with far more French wine, Bordeaux wine, than actually if you lived there. It's a bit like New Zealand. I mean, there's more New Zealand wine here than there is in New Zealand, in my experience. And at least it was when I went. And so he came over. He came over in 1666, and he established a pub. Britain, effectively London's first French restaurant, which he called the Pontac's Head. It was in Abchurch Street, just behind the Old Bailey. And it's rather fanciful to think that this is it. A French ordinary. Of course, restaurants were not called restaurants at the time. They were called ordinaries. And how do we know it's a French one, French restaurant? Well, number one, it says so. That kind of helps. But also we can see that there's a frog, a cat, and a dog hanging in the larder. And the restaurateur chef is emptying today's rejects into tomorrow's soup, which makes it certifiably French. And of course, one guy in particular really picked up on this stuff. I mean, Pete went mental for it. I actually read Pete at one point, and the mention, he'd go out and he'd have another bottle of O'Brien. Oh, and it was so delicious and all the rest of it. But it was jolly expensive. But it was 4 times more expensive than equivalent wines. These new French clarets, as they were called. And Pete absolutely charts. You want to see how they arrived and how they were consumed and how they were perceived? Well, just read Pete. He'll tell you all about it. And he loved them. He just went into heaven. Another one that I particularly liked was Sir Robert Walpole. He's here. So these guys, the wealthy, became mega addicted to this stuff. It became a badge of honor that you actually had to have tons of new French clarets, just as badges of honor. I mean, and you weren't, just prove you weren't a complete idiot, because they were remarkably good. And so Walpole's problem was, while he was serving as Prime Minister, we were very unusually for Britain, we were at war with France, very exceptional. And so it was criminal offence to import wine from France. So what Walpole did, he came up with a wheeze that he went down to the Tower of London, grabbed an Admiralty launch, went to Amsterdam and bought 16,000 bottles for his own consumption. 16,000 bottles. And therefore, earning the distinction of having invented the booze cruise. So our glassmaking really took off from the scientific revolution. And of course, we were having our own empire now. We were in India, the Caribbean, North America, blah, blah, blah. Our confidence was way up. So everybody else liked poncy, frilly glassware, but we didn't. What we wanted was roast beef and Yorkshire pud and heavy barrister wine glasses. Everybody in Europe knocked them. They said they were too heavy to lift from the table and all this sort of nonsense. But for me, they are kind of one of the purest expressions of English taste. They really are. They're so dumpy and heavy, and they're like Queen Anne houses. There's an elegance to them, but it's 3 windows at the top, front door in the middle of the ground floor, and one on either side. It's not exactly OTT taste. But we went there, and by the mid-century we were dallying again in kind of some Venetian kind of glass with the twisty stems. And when I saw these to start with, these mid-18th century drinking glasses, I thought, what on earth can they be for? I thought they might be for training flea circuses or, drowning budgies or something or other. But they're about the shape. This tiny bowl sizes were dictated by this. You see, the practice of toasting. The only way you could get drink in polite company in the mid 18th century in England was to actually by toasting. So, and here we have a naive painting of the Great Room on a British warship in about 1760. And you might wonder what these guys are doing at the front. Well, they are actually talking to one another. If you thought that Dan Dare or Fred Bassett invented bubble dialogue, you would absolutely be wrong, because here it is being exercised in 1760. And the guy on the left is lifting his glass and saying to his mate, "Success to the British fleet." And his mate to the right is responding with the toast, "To women, love and wind." Apparently women suffered a lot of wind at the time. So anyway, we give up on those tiny little stupid glasses that nobody could, you just sort of get your tongue damp on. And we get into these kind of half pint, full pint rummers. And in the meantime, the decanter has gone from 1649 from, again, kind of, very dull crockery, flower pot-esque sort of vessels to glass ones, which are much more ergonomic and robust and easy to clean. And if you look, the Earl of Bedford, his account survived from this period. And if people have done graphs of his purchases of ceramic objects for drinking wine, and then they are totally eclipsed and then vastly supplanted by the rise of glassware over the same period. It's just like an X, basically. And here's what, in 1700, if you were Edward Williams studying at Jesus College, Oxford, that was your carafe. And if you were AP down the pub in 1713, that was your bottle. Decanters weren't allowed on the table under the etiquette of the era, and so decanters were really kind of pretty low-looking things, sort of milk bottles, not much more than milk bottles in terms of their decoration. They did have these rather weird sides which were intended to cool the contents of the wine, because the contents of the wine at the time was so disgusting you needed to drink it at virtually freezing point in order to make it palatable. But then the etiquette changed and decanters were allowed on the table. And I don't know if you notice any stylistic difference between decanters not allowed on the table, decanters allowed on the table. And of course they become profoundly flash, all singing, all dancing, eye-popping, amazing things, as opposed to kind of dull little milk bottles. This one I particularly like, because if you got so hammered that you couldn't be bothered to pick up the decanter anymore, what you could do is lay your head on the table and they could wheel it over to you and just fill you up from the tap. Posh decanters. Great. Second exhibition, London exhibition, 1862. Aspie Palat. Darling, they're coming over tonight. Do you think we should use the Cobra or the Cockatoo? Well, I don't know. It's difficult. How about the frigging and the rigging one? Well, that's all very well as long as you're not having to do the washing up in a Belfast sink, And, of course, nowadays, people don't even use glasses, let alone decanters. And I particularly like this story from today. This is the cover of today's Sun. And I don't think, I've got the sneaking suspicion that the Yob did not drink 20 cans of cider out of a decanter. What an extraordinary story that is. Anyway, so, yeah, I'm sure he doesn't even own a decanter, that guy. So, yeah, well, let's have a quick look at a couple of sort of subdivisions of this vast and sprawling subject. Decanter, champagne, well, there he is, the master himself, Dom Perignon, and his sister, Veuve Clicquot, younger sister, it has to be said. Well, of course, without them, we wouldn't have, well, we wouldn't have had the champagne as we know it as quickly as we did as Europeans. And they give rise to this splendid drink. And there unusually are two forms of wine glasses that come out of this. Interesting, I really like this Dutch portrait and still life in that we've got two kinds of flute. We've got a flute by his elbow, and we also have a flute by the white statue at the back, white figurine sort of thing. There we go. This is 1600, cigar stem, a flute full of white wine or champagne. And then this is what, about the same, yeah, Venetian, English beer flutes from 1750. That one's a bit later. But flutes for beer, sparkling drinks, and we have the coupe. These are 1650 to 1700 Venetian. What extraordinary things! It was said that Napoleon had invented the coupe by forming plaster on one of Marie Antoinette's breasts. Well, if that were the case, bearing in mind that she would have been 250 years old at the time, she must have been a very old woman when he did that to her. English antique, 1750. Victorian. Interesting how the flute and the coupe, I've done a YouTube video on the difference between the flute and the coupe. 20 years ago, when we opened our shop, flutes absolutely were ascendant. Today, coupes have entirely supplanted them. This is one from Barbara's Way. This is from Coasley Archives. It was a glass drawn, designed for Andrew Carnegie by Richardson's. And I contacted the Carnegie Institute after I found this. I said, oh, if you're interested in this, but I actually found reference to Andrew Carnegie's glasses. We are banned by our constitution from having anything to do with Andrew Carnegie. We can have no interest in whatsoever. He devised the system where he was to be completely anonymous. Wonderful, wonderful, perfect things. And of course, you didn't take a great deal of corruption of the coupe to end up with the cocktail glass. It's only been one, despite everything that Riedel might, propagandize. I don't know if anybody watches Maxi Riedel on YouTube, on Instagram, but boy, is that guy on, and what a smoothie. I mean, Riedels have absolutely made it sort of their business to enter, to master, to totally dominate the fine glass market, and they've made outlandish claims on a regular basis. But fact is that there has only been one new wine glass in the last century, and that is in fact the brandy balloon. All the others are deviations and modifications of much earlier forms, most dating from the Renaissance. And so, yeah, as for the wine itself, well, the French tendency to classify things as parodied in the Daily Mail by the straight banana hoax, was that in 1855, of course, they classified all the wine, all the vineyards, the produce of all the vineyards of the Bordeaux region, the Classement de 1855. And that study found that 38% of the wines of Bordeaux were Vin de Table, 15% were Vin du Pays, 2% were Vin Supérieur, 35% were Appellation Contrôlée. And just 4 chateaux were nominated as Premier Cru, i.e. first growth, i.e. Arnaud de Pontac III. And the first one of them is Chateau Margaux, or they are, in no particular order, Chateau Lafite, Chateau Latour, and there is Arnaud's original wine, Chateau Haut-Brion. And extraordinarily, as you will know, I'm sure there has only been one. There have been actually some more recent changes to the 1855 classification, but only one major mega change, and that was, of course, that the final, blooming last admission of Mouton Rothschild to the club of the Premier Cru wine producers for reasons that we all know nauseatingly only too well. And then they got hit by phylloxera. This huge, I mean, this is a particularly large one. Not many are this big. I mean, look at this one in scale to the Eiffel Tower. That, you know, that's just absolutely huge. And they absolutely decimated the vineyards of France. And it is obviously just an aphid. It's basically, you know, it's in the same family as blackfly. And basically what happens is the eggs get laid on the leaves. The little beasties then hatch out and head south towards their best restaurant in town. And their dream food, no, it's not McDonald's, is vine roots. And what they did is they head south, ate all the roots and killed all the vines. And they absolutely just wiped Bordeaux out. They got 1875 pre-phylloxera, 5 million hectolitres annual production, smashed by 75% in the succeeding years. And that was Armagnac, Calvados, Calvados is apples actually, and it's all cognac and all that, all the brandies, all the wines, all the champagnes, they all went fucked. And of course, they all got replanted by American vines and built themselves back. Just before closing, I just love, I mean, how much people pay for this stuff. So here are the 6 most expensive bottles of wine ever sold at auction. So, I mean, I wouldn't give you 10 bob for any bottle of sherry, but somebody paid $43,000 for a 1775 bottle of sherry. There's a bottle of Mouton Rothschild, 5th most expensive bottle of wine ever sold. Of course, it's l'année de la victoire. It's 1945, the greatest year by the greatest chateau, and that went for $115,000. Then we get this extraordinary bottle of Chateau Lafite. You know, some of you will know the story because it's an absolute blinder. I haven't got time to fully go into it, but purportedly, this was a bottle, Thomas Jefferson's bottle. It was discovered when knocking down a cellar wall in Paris, and there was Thomas Jefferson's wine cellar. Oh, magnifico, or magnificent, or whatever they say. And of course, it was a revelatory discovery. It all came up for auction, and this bottle went for $160,000. Thomas Jefferson's original 1789 bottle, or 1787 bottle of Chateau Lafite. Well, the fact it was a complete fraud. I mean, somebody made it in their backyard in Halifax or something, you know. It was a total stitch-up. But the nitwit who bought it decided, you know what he decided to do? Yeah, you do, because you've heard this story before. He decided they needed to drink it. So they got together, these mates, having to spend $160,000 dollars on a bottle of hooch. And then they opened it, took one taste and went, God, that's disgusting! Which, of course, inevitably it was going to be. So what do they do next? Bloody dropped it on the floor to claim on the insurance. So that's what happened. So they dropped it on the floor. Guy came round to assess it, and he said, where's the cork? He said, it's there. He said, where's that? He said, on the end of the corkscrew. It was absolutely obvious what they'd done. So they got, you know, banged up for that, and then the entire story was then exposed as being a complete fraud in the first place. Wonderful story. It's going to make somebody a great movie. The third most expensive bottle of wine was a High-Sec Monopole Blue Top, and they had these on special in Aldi for $14.99 last Christmas, but I don't think it's one of them. This bottle of High-Sec Monopole was discovered when the last ship going up the Baltic of relief supplies to the Tsar in 1916-17 was sunk by a German U-boat. Really, during the First World War, they did have U-boats. They sunk this thing, and what So there was some champagne on board, but of more interest to marine salvage guys, there were 5 tons of bullion gold on board. And the divers went on to get the gold, of course, and they grabbed, and the entire cargo was destined for the Tsar. So they recovered this bottle of Monopole that had been sitting on the bottom of the Baltic since 1916 and put it up for sale. And it sold for $275,000. Yeah, obviously completely undrinkable. And anybody who tells me that, Russian oligarchs haven't got enough money obviously need a slight rethink. Second most expensive bottle of wine ever sold at auction was about 1974 Imperial. So it's a bit of a cheat. It's 8 bottle of Cheval Blanc. So on this bottle, we can read, it says, if you read the label, it says, Bouteille rebouchée par le Château in 2016. So what they've done is at Cheval Blanc is that they have been safeguarding this wine. Best year, 47, 45, 47, 2 best years. 47, they got 8 bottles that have been held in their own cellars. They then rebottled them into an Imperial and then gave them to Sotheby's or Christie's to sell. And so what this bottle comes with is an absolute guarantee from Cheval Blanc that this wine is going to be in superb condition because they've just been handling it. And that went for $304,000. Third of a million, what? That's about 8 million quid these days, isn't it? But the most expensive world price for a bottle of wine ever sold at auction, it was a charity job. It's a bottle of Screaming Eagle, another 8 bottler, great year. For those who don't know, Screaming Eagle is a Napa Valley wine. It only makes it, it's like Rothschild, they only might make it in the great years. They don't produce it and they have maybe 5,000 bottles of Screaming Eagle. It's very limited supply. It's guaranteed to be absolutely fabulous, and it's sold in Water Aid or one of them auctions for $500,000. Single bottle of wine. Well, it's sold in Silicon Valley, didn't it? So Steve Jobs or somebody like that bought it. But that is the most expensive that I know of. But I do like this guy. He had just spent the world record price on a bottle of Burgundy. I can't remember which one it is, but it's a red Burgundy, obviously. And they said, well, how come the reporters went up to him afterwards and said, are you completely mental having spent 80,000 quid or something on a bottle of red Burgundy? He said, no, I'm not mental at all. He said, I am 75 years old. I am just retiring. I've just sold my business for a shed load of money. And so tonight, on the chosen, I have bought this bottle of wine to share with my 5 greatest friends de naissance, my school pals, who I'm still friends with, and we are going to have a glass each to celebrate what an incredible life we've led. And boy, what a great way. If you've got more money than, you can shake a stick at, good luck to you, Buster. Of course, when it comes to my own favourite bottle of wine, then it's this one. 200-year-old bottle of port. Drinking on duty is strictly forbidden for roadshow experts. Yuck. Trust Glassware and McConnell to test the rules on this memorable evening. So this bottle came in with some wine in it. We got a syringe. We managed to get it out, and I swigged it. I swigged huge quantities of this wine, and then later it was revealed under chemical analysis that it contained brass tacks. What else did it have? Human hair and human urine in it. So there's after we just heard the news that I'd actually drunk some drunk. I dampened my tongue very slightly with this stuff, and of course it made great telly, and it was just sheer great fun, and it went absolutely. It was broadcasted on just before New Year's Eve, and there was no other news around, so it was kind of dead news period, and it went absolutely all over the world. I looked up, I went looking for it. The New Zealand Herald's Facebook page, its version of it had done 10,000 likes in New Zealand. It just went absolutely what's called viral. Note of septic tank, wrote the Daily Telegraph. File surprise for antiques guru. Love it. And what did he say? McConnell was allowed to transfer a sample. His boss said, "You're not going to drink that, are you, Andy? It smelled absolutely rank," said the antiquarian. I thought, let's do it. There wasn't any real mental process, or if there was, it was me being completely mental. Yes! So anyway, so I've got a book out. It's been mentioned ahead of time. This is the details. Drop me a line. Love to sell you a copy. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm decimated. I'm heartbroken to tell you that that's all, folks. There we go. Are you all? I hope there are survivors from this.
Brilliant. Absolutely lovely.
Nobody's ever told me that before.
Well, no, I wasn't talking about you.
Oh, I see. Sorry.
Fantastic, Andy. Superb entertainment and education.
Great. Thanks, Barbara.
Absolutely amazing.
Really wonderful evening. Thank you.
Oh.
Quite exhausting, really.
How do you think I felt?
Well done, Andy. It's great practice for all the ladies.
I tell you what, it's much harder when you can't hear people. You know, you can't hear people laughing. I mean, you're doing it inside a thermos flask. It's hermetically sealed, and so that it's actually you have no idea if people are getting offended or not. Mind you, it wouldn't make any difference, really.
Oh, I can assure you, we were laughing. It was great. Thank you.
Glad to hear it.
And Andy, following that, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course you can.
If you had to drink your favourite drink out of a glass, the last thing on earth you did, and you were allowed to choose any glass ever made, what glass would you choose?
Okay, I'd be more interested in the wine. You know, I wouldn't mind. I have drunk Mouton Rothschild from great years, and I have a friend who really was seriously into the great wines, and frankly, as an absolute, I mean, Vertellini, you know, of course, I mean, we've been an enormous privilege, and V&A has had these amazing days when one can go in and handle things as glass nutters, and of course, you know, they've got Ravenscroft out for me, and I've handled it, and one does. If you don't feel the echo of history, then basically I think you're, you know, emotionally dead. You know, I think wonderful. So if you get, so I would say something really early like that. You know, it's just something that shouts down or even whispers down from history. That, but drinking something really great, something that the drink of a lifetime, like the old boy who bought the Burgundy. You know, that's what a sublime moment that must have been for him. And you know, I really recognise what he said when he described the sentiments that were involved in that purchase of his. Yeah.
Have you ever had the chance to look at the Glass Cellars collection of glass, Andy?
No, every time I go in there, they confiscate my catapult.
Ah.
You did have a look at some of it in the Glaziers Hall, I remember.
I did.
Yes, there's not much of age or distinction, but interesting collection that's been donated to the Glass Cellars.
Yeah, actually, frankly, to be absolutely honest, I can't remember any of it. But there's a lady exercising bottoms up. Martin Gibbons is Toy Girl.
Yes. No, I've been queuing up.
Yeah, well, that's what I call it, emptying it out, bottoms up, lifting the foot to the ceiling. Well done, girl. You're not as daft as I look.
The one piece that's fascinating me that we have was presented by a past master, and it's it was presented by Julio Salviati.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, it's a glass table centerpiece, but it's in pieces and needs some attention. So I'm intending to talk to our little man, David Wilkinson, to have a look at it.
I'm sure he'd love being called your little man. He'd be pleased. He'd be pleased at that.
Upcoming master, yes.
He's smiling wanly at that.
Yeah. he loves
Well, holding the revolver
on
under
the
the
bottom
table.
now.
Andy, funny question. You showed us leather wine bottles before the introduction of glass and so forth. How long did wine last in leather?
Well, I wonder what the wine. I think if we were to drink wine of the period, we would think that somebody's pulling our leg, or at least pulling our taste buds. I think that we would, if one is armed with one's taste buds now and go back and drink the wine of the period, I think it was pretty rough old gear, and a lot of it was very close to vinegar. It didn't last, and so people drank stuff on a daily basis that we wouldn't shake a tonsil at. So I think all of it was, fairly universally vile, I suspect, by modern standards. I mean, obviously, in virtually every respect that one can imagine, we are completely spoilt rotten. History has left us as kind of, the post-war spoilt rotten babies who've had everything easy and rich and with fine wine and fine food. I think if you were to go back and drink Chaucer's wine, you'd need a bucket, to sort of empty your tummy into after a few mouthfuls. No, I don't think it was up to much. Pretty rough old stuff. Unless, of course, you were on site, if you were at a vineyard, but that isn't where they were. The cork wasn't introduced until 1700, so it was all done with wooden wedges. Well, you try and took out a nice bottle of wine, take the cork out, put a wooden wedge in it, and see what it tastes like in a week. It would be rubbish. I mean, it just stands to reason. Of course, they sealed them in wax and so on, but no, I think that we wouldn't swim a lake for the wines of yore.
It's a sobering thought, Andy, that if Sir Robert Mansell hadn't obtained a monopoly for coal because he owned so many coal mines, and persuaded James I to ban the burning of wood in 1612, I think it was. And so we then melted glass at a much higher temperature. People might not have found a bottle to withstand the pressure of cider and champagne.
I know. Well, that was the last talk, though.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Yeah, which
it's quite a thought, though, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. I mean, there's no doubting that the change in the quality of English glass from basically really from 1650 to the end of the century. I mean, that, it started earlier with Merritt, the translation, but Merritt's translation is 1660 something or other, isn't it? It's the last 40 years of the 17th century that saw England take on the world. I mean, we were transformed in that period from an also-ran to world champs, in which we remained for 250 years in many things, including wine bottles.
And the brilliance of the glass sellers, too, to back Ravenscroft to invent lead crystal.
Oh, well,
if he did. In 1660.
I raise my hat to you all. Some of you were obviously there at the time, and really well done.
Andy, I think we've... Oh, help, what's happened? I've done something to myself.
You're there.
Put your penknife down, for God's sake.
I did the wrong thing to the message thing. I think probably the time has come. We've taken up too much of your valuable time.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in a car and drive to London now.
Right. That was a tour de force. That was absolutely magnificent. I mean, what an astonishingly knowledgeable and erudite survey of the history of drinking, the danger of drinking water. Keep drinking your wine, chaps. And the evolution of the making of wine vessels, drinking vessels, and storage vessels, also magnificently, lavishly illustrated. I mean, it's a really professional performance, but you are a professional, so we're honoured to have enjoyed that. That was really fantastic. Next time you'll have to talk about Scotch. Do you do Scotch?
And only where I'm wearing a kilt.
We'd love to see you wearing a kilt.
You cheeky monkey.
With a name like McConnell, but I think it's actually Irish, isn't it, Andy, not Scottish?
Well, I think we were Highlands and then booted out and we went to Ulster and then we came in back again. You know, we got spudded out. We got thrown out of every... I've been thrown out of some really good places in several countries.
That was... We're so grateful to you for sparing the time and educating us so widely. It was riveting and so witty and amusing and so erudite. So on behalf of the Glassware Company, 1,000 thanks for a memorable evening. Thank you.
Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Martin Scarf, yeah, there he is. Hi, Martin. Evening all.
Very much, Andy, and thank you everybody for turning up. I'm very much looking forward to welcoming you next Wednesday for those that are joining us at St James Garlic Hythe and the Bakers Hall. Time to have another gathering and have some real life conversation one-to-one. And meantime, I wish you all a very nice weekend. I have a feeling that although it was expected today, it is promised that we're going to see some sunshine this weekend. So do enjoy, and I'll speak to you all again soon. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks,
Bye.